The vampire princess thought her human husband was harmless, until the blood war revealed his true Lyra, princess of the vampire kingdom, stood in the grand hall of the royal palace, her eyes fixed on the ornate silver doors that led into the chamber. The sunlight from the high windows bathed the room in a warm, golden glow, a stark contrast to the cold, dark shadows of her heritage. Her vampire blood thrummed beneath her skin, ancient and strong, a power that had shaped the course of history for centuries. She was not only a princess, but a warrior, fierce, unyielding, and feared by all who dared challenge her. Today, however, she was expected to play a very different role. The human man standing before her was to be her husband. At first, Lyra had scoffed at the very idea, a human. The thought was laughable. Humans were weak, fragile creatures, easily crushed beneath the might of the vampires. They had no place in the affairs of the supernatural, let alone in her life. But her father, the king, had insisted on the union, an alliance forged through marriage, one meant to solidify the fragile peace between their worlds. The kingdom of vampires had long been at war with their enemies. The lycanthropes and the human world had become a battleground. The kingdom needed allies, and the human king had proposed the marriage to secure a treaty. In truth, Lyra had little choice in the matter. Her father's decision was final. She, the heir to the vampire throne, could not refuse without risking the very stability of the kingdom. So here she was, standing in front of the massive doors, waiting to meet her new husband. When the doors finally swung open, Lyra's gaze swept over the figure entering the room. Sebastian, a human noble, walked in with the composure of someone used to standing in high places, though his presence was a stark contrast to the dark grandeur of the vampire court. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his piercing green eyes met hers without hesitation, as if he had no fear at all. Lyra raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. He was handsome in a way, but that meant nothing to her. His humanity was his greatest flaw, and no matter his appearance, she could never view him as anything more than a political tool. "Your Highness," Sebastian said, bowing with a polite grace that suggested he had been taught how to handle royalty. His voice was calm, even soft, but there was an undercurrent of strength in it that caught her attention. "It is an honor to meet you." The words were perfectly polite, yet Lyra found herself scrutinizing him with the same keen eye she used when evaluating her enemies. She was not fooled by appearances. Humans were unpredictable, but they were also fragile. He might be noble, but he was still just a man. "You may rise, Lord Sebastian," Lyra replied coolly, her tone giving nothing away. "The honor is mine, I'm sure." Sebastian straightened up, his eyes not leaving hers. There was a certain steadiness in his gaze, a lack of the fear that most humans displayed when in the presence of vampires. She was used to seeing terror in their eyes, the kind of fear that came from knowing their lives could end with a single swipe of her hand. But not this man. He seemed unfazed. "Tell me," she asked, her voice cold and controlled, "how does a human noble such as yourself find the courage to stand before me without fear?" Sebastian hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words. Then he smiled, a small, faint curve of his lips that somehow made his green eyes appear even more intense. "I've learned that fear only holds power over you if you let it, and I have no intention of letting fear control me." Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him further. There was a quiet strength in his words, something she hadn't expected, but it didn't change the fact that he was still human, weak, soft, and vulnerable. "You'll find that the vampire kingdom is not a place for the weak, Lord Sebastian," Lyra said, her tone hardening. "We do not bow to fear, and we do not tolerate weakness." Sebastian nodded, his expression unwavering. "I understand, Your Highness, but strength doesn't always come from power alone." Lyra's gaze flicked to the marble floor as if his words were beneath her. She had heard such sentiments before from the humans who tried to impress her with their platitudes. In her mind, there was only one true form of strength: power, the ability to dominate and control, to bend others to your will. "We shall see," she muttered, more to herself than to him. The silence between them stretched for a moment, heavy with the weight of their respective worlds, worlds that had been on the brink of war for generations. The peace between their nations was fragile, and it would depend on this marriage, this union, to hold it all together. But what if that peace couldn't hold? What if the war was inevitable? As if sensing the tension in the air, Sebastian spoke again, his voice soft but determined. I do not expect you to see me as an equal, Your Highness, but I will earn your respect in time. Lyra couldn't help but study him again, this time with a hint of curiosity. He seemed so certain of himself, so unwavering in his belief that he could earn her respect. But what did that really mean? Was this simply his human arrogance, or was there more to him than met the eye? You will find, Lord Sebastian, she said, her voice colder now, that respect must be earned in blood, and it is something that neither of us can afford to take lightly. Sebastian bowed again, his eyes never leaving hers. I understand, Your Highness. I look forward to learning how. The months that followed the marriage were anything but peaceful. Lyra had expected the union to be nothing more than a formal arrangement, a simple political maneuver to strengthen the kingdom's position in the ongoing conflict. But as the days wore on, she found herself constantly observing her husband, Sebastian. It was not love that drew her attention to him. It was something else, something deeper. Sebastian had settled into his new life in the vampire court with surprising ease. He was never overbearing, never tried to assert his dominance. He quietly navigated the intricacies of vampire politics, speaking when necessary, always observing and learning. He had made no attempt to challenge her position, nor had he ever complained about the overwhelming power and ancient traditions of the vampire world. Instead, he simply existed beside her, a quiet presence in her life. She had expected him to be intimidated, to cower in the face of the danger that always lingered in the shadows of the palace. After all, he was human, but he never seemed afraid. When their paths crossed in the palace halls, when they spoke during formal gatherings, there was always an underlying calm in his eyes, a calm that unsettled her. The vampire court was full of political scheming, whispers of betrayal and power plays, but Sebastian moved through it all with the grace of someone who had seen far more dangerous things in his life. It was almost as though he belonged here, in a world that should have been foreign to him. The other vampires, too, began to take notice. Some, like the older lords, dismissed him as nothing more than a tool for peace. But others whispered that there was more to Sebastian than met the eye. Lyra, though, remained focused on her duties as the kingdom's protector. The war with the lycanthropes had never truly ended. It had been on pause like the calm before a storm. But the peace between their worlds was always fragile, hanging by a thin thread, and in the distance there were signs of unrest. One evening, as Lyra stood at the balcony overlooking the vampire city, the night sky stretched endlessly above her, a sea of stars flickering in the dark. The wind, cool and crisp, whispered through her dark hair as she thought about the future. She had been raised to fight, to lead the vampire forces with a fierce hand, but the weight of her new responsibilities as a wife and queen was starting to grow heavier with each passing day. She looked down at the city, at the thousands of vampires who had pledged their loyalty to her and the kingdom. Could she protect them from the coming storm? The sound of footsteps behind her broke her thoughts, and she turned to see Sebastian approaching, his face illuminated by the faint moonlight. His expression was unreadable, but there was a certain tension in the air around him. Something is wrong, he said quietly, his voice low but steady. Lyra raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sharpness in his tone. What do you mean? Sebastian's eyes scanned the horizon, his green gaze narrowing as if he could see something others could not. There are whispers. The lycanthropes are gathering their forces again. I've heard rumors of new alliances forming, alliances that even the vampire court doesn't fully understand. Lyra's stomach tightened. She had sensed something in the air as well, an unease that had spread through the kingdom like wildfire. But hearing it from Sebastian, he who was still in many ways an outsider to their world, felt different. It made her worry more than she wanted to admit. Why are you telling me this? Lyra asked, her voice colder now, though she couldn't hide the flicker of concern that crossed her features. Sebastian turned to face her, his expression serious. Because, Your Highness, I believe we are being watched. And I believe the war is coming again, perhaps sooner than we think. The words hung heavy in the air between them. Lyra took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had been prepared for this, for the possibility of war. The vampire kingdom had always lived in the shadow of conflict, but the idea that the war could return with such suddenness, without warning, was something else entirely. It would be catastrophic. What do you suggest we do? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Sebastian's gaze softened, his usual calm unwavering. We prepare. We strengthen our defenses, and we try to uncover who is behind this. The lycanthropes are not the only threat, Lyra. Someone is stirring the pot, and we need to know who it is before it's too late. Lyra nodded slowly, her mind already working through the possibilities. Her father, the king, had always been a master of diplomacy, but even he could not prevent the inevitable clash that seemed to loom on the horizon. There was only one way to stop it now, by taking matters into her own hands. "We will begin preparations," she said firmly, "and we will find out who is behind this. You have my word." Sebastian bowed his head slightly, a small sign of respect. "I will do whatever I can to help." Over the next few weeks, Lyra and Sebastian worked together, quietly gathering intelligence, speaking with trusted allies, and observing the strange movements in the kingdom. Lyra was impressed by Sebastian's ability to remain composed, even when things seemed to grow more uncertain. His calm presence steadied her in ways she hadn't expected. The more time she spent with him, the more she began to realize that there was more to him than the simple human noble who had been thrust into this world. One evening, as they sat in a quiet chamber reviewing the intelligence they had gathered, Lyra noticed something unusual in Sebastian's posture. His normally relaxed demeanor was tense, his fingers lightly tapping the surface of the table. "What's on your mind?" she asked, unable to keep the curiosity from her voice. Sebastian glanced up, meeting her eyes. "I fear there is a traitor in the court, someone within our own ranks who is feeding information to the lycanthropes. I cannot say who yet, but the patterns are there. It's only a matter of time before the traitor's true allegiance becomes clear." Lyra's heart sank. A traitor? In her court? It was a thought too terrifying to fully comprehend. But Sebastian's calm certainty was unsettling, and she knew that he was not one to make baseless accusations. "Then we will find them," Lyra said, her voice colder than ever. "No one betrays the vampire kingdom and lives." As the days passed, the tension in the palace became unbearable. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for the first move in what was sure to be an all-out war. And then, one fateful night, the first signs of betrayal came. Lyra received word of a surprise attack on one of her border towns, a town that had been under heavy protection. The lycanthropes had breached the defenses, their forces overwhelming the human and vampire soldiers stationed there. It was clear now. The war had returned. The attack on the border town was just the beginning. Lyra stood before the large map that covered the stone wall of the war room, her eyes scanning the shifting patterns of the battle. The news from the front lines had been grim. The lycanthrope forces, though initially scattered, had united under a new leader, someone who had the strategy and charisma to rally even the most rogue factions of their kind. This new leader had proven himself not just in battle, but in cunning. The lycanthropes were no longer an unorganized horde, they were a well-coordinated army, and it was growing stronger by the day. Lyra clenched her fists, the vampire blood surging through her veins, demanding action. She had been trained for this, raised to lead her people through war, but this war was different. It wasn't just about strength and power anymore. There was something hidden beneath the surface, something darker that she had only begun to understand. Sebastian entered the war room, his usual calm presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. He was no soldier, no warrior like the others, but there was something about the way he carried himself that commanded attention. Something in his demeanor that was both reassuring and unsettling. He had been invaluable in the past days, helping her make decisions and keeping her focused when it felt like everything was falling apart. "What news?" Lyra asked, her voice tight with tension. Sebastian didn't immediately respond. Instead, he walked to the map, tracing the lines of the kingdom's borders with his fingers. "The lycanthropes are pushing deeper into our territory. We've lost 3 more towns. The cities along the northern pass will fall within days unless we act quickly." "Do we know who's leading them?" Lyra asked, though she already knew the answer. It had been the question that had been on her mind since the first attack. This wasn't the work of any ordinary lycanthrope leader. This was someone who knew how to plan, how to strike at the heart of her kingdom without hesitation. Sebastian looked up, his eyes dark with thought. "Not yet, but I have my suspicions. There's someone within our own ranks feeding information to them. The attacks are too precise. It's as if they knew exactly where we would be weakest." Lyra's breath caught in her chest. A traitor. She had feared it from the moment she'd seen the first signs of discord within the court. But now, with the evidence mounting, the realization was unavoidable. "Who would dare?" she muttered, more to herself than to him. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the mystery. It was one thing to lose a battle. It was another to lose because someone on the inside had turned against them. Sebastian studied her carefully, sensing the weight of her thoughts. "We have to find them, Lyra. This war cannot be won without first identifying the traitor. And if they are feeding information to the lycanthropes, then they must be stopped." Lyra nodded, her eyes steely with resolve. "I will not let this kingdom fall, not now, not ever." The two of them spent hours in the war room, poring over maps, analyzing the information they had gathered from the front lines. Sebastian's ability to remain calm and logical in the face of such danger was something that amazed her. He was always calculating, always thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. It was a quality that no one in the vampire court had expected from him. No one had expected the human to be more than a political pawn. But now, with each passing hour, Lyra began to see just how wrong they had been. By the time the sun began to rise, Lyra had made her decision. She would go to the front lines herself. There was no time to waste. The lycanthropes would not wait for her to find the traitor. They would keep pushing forward until they reached the heart of the vampire kingdom. And if she didn't act now, the war would be lost before it even truly began. Sebastian accompanied her to the northern pass, where the first of the attacks had occurred. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, and the distant sounds of battle echoed across the landscape. The town had been completely overtaken, reduced to ruins. What remained of the villagers had either fled or been captured. Lyra's heart hardened as she surveyed the devastation. The lycanthropes had been efficient, ruthless. As they walked through the wreckage, Lyra's mind was consumed with thoughts of the traitor. She could almost feel their presence lurking in the shadows, watching her every move. Whoever it was, they had betrayed everything she stood for. They had betrayed their own people. "Do you still think the traitor is one of us?" Lyra asked, breaking the silence between them. Sebastian's eyes scanned the destruction around them. "I'm not sure anymore. There are rumors, whispers, but nothing concrete. Whoever it is, they're good at covering their tracks." "And what about you, Sebastian?" Lyra turned to him, her gaze narrowing slightly. "Have you been hiding something from me?" Sebastian stopped walking, turning to face her. His eyes were calm, steady. "You don't trust me?" The question caught her off guard. She had been so focused on the war, on the traitor, that she hadn't stopped to consider Sebastian's role in all of this. She had never once questioned his loyalty, but now, with the war at her doorstep and the traitor still at large, a seed of doubt had been planted. "I trust you," she said, though her voice was tinged with uncertainty. "But there are things happening that I can't explain. Secrets that I don't understand." Sebastian's expression softened. He took a step closer to her, his voice low. "There are things in this world that even I don't understand, Lyra, but I promise you I'm on your side, I always will be." His words, though simple, carried a weight that she couldn't ignore. In that moment, Lyra realized something. She had never truly understood Sebastian, not in the way she should have. He was a human, yes, but he was more than that. He had a strength, a power that had been hidden from her and everyone else, and she wasn't sure why he had kept it hidden, but she would find out. As they continued through the ruined town, Lyra's thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound in the distance. A whispering wind carried it to her ears, footsteps, soft but purposeful. Someone was approaching. Without a word, she motioned for Sebastian to take cover. They hid behind a broken wall, their eyes watching the figure as it drew closer. It was a man, a human, dressed in the ragged clothing of a soldier. His face was covered in dirt, his eyes wide with fear. He moved quickly, scanning the area around him, unaware of Lyra and Sebastian's presence. As he neared the center of the town, he stopped, looking around as if searching for something or someone. Lyra felt a sudden surge of tension. This man was out of place. He didn't belong here. "Who is he?" she whispered to Sebastian. Sebastian studied the man for a moment, his brow furrowing in thought. "I don't know, but I've seen him before, in the court." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. A member of the court, a spy, perhaps. The realization hit her like a wave. This was no random soldier. This was the traitor. Before she could move, the man turned, his eyes locking onto hers. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched behind the ruined wall, barely breathing, trying to stay hidden. The man had seen them. She was sure of it. His eyes had locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a chill through her spine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. She couldn't make out his expression, fear, recognition, or something else, but the way he moved, the way he shifted his weight, told her everything she needed to know. He knew they were watching. Sebastian's hand was on her arm, pulling her back, his voice urgent but low. "We need to move now?" They slipped through the shadows, darting between fallen structures and broken walls, their movements swift and quiet. Lyra's mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. A traitor, a member of the court. She had been right, but this was no ordinary betrayal. The man knew more than just the location of the border towns. He knew about the plans, the defenses, the vulnerable points in their kingdom. And now he was here, in the heart of the destruction he had helped bring about. They found a narrow alleyway that led deeper into the heart of the town, a place where they could hide and observe without being seen. Lyra leaned against the cold stone, her breathing shallow, her pulse still racing. The weight of the situation pressed down on her shoulders. This wasn't just a battle for the future of the vampire kingdom anymore. This was personal. The traitor had ties to her court, and if they couldn't stop him, the entire kingdom could be lost. Sebastian stood beside her, watching the man as he moved cautiously through the ruins. He was muttering to himself, his hands shaking slightly, but his movements were calculated. He wasn't looking for something, he was waiting for someone. "What do we do?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian's eyes remained fixed on the man. "We follow him. Find out who he's meeting and why. We need answers." Lyra nodded. She had never been one to back down from a fight, but this wasn't a fight. It was a game of shadows and whispers, and the man in front of them was the key to unlocking everything. The war, the betrayal, the destruction, it all led back to him. They waited in silence as the man slowly made his way toward the edge of the town. Lyra's senses were on high alert, her vampire instincts pushing her to act, to confront him head-on. But she knew that wasn't the way. Not yet. Finally, the man reached a secluded spot near the edge of the ruins. He paused, glancing over his shoulder, and then he knelt down, pulling something from the folds of his tattered clothing. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she saw him retrieve a small, worn map, the edges frayed from years of use. He spread it out on the ground in front of him, tracing lines with his finger. Sebastian leaned in closer to Lyra, his breath warm against her ear. "He's marking something." A plan, perhaps? Lyra's mind raced. The map was a key, a map to the very heart of their defenses, the weak spots that had been exploited time and again by the lycanthropes. But what did this man know that the rest of the court did? Who was he meeting, and what role did he play in the larger game? Without warning, a figure appeared from the shadows behind the man. Lyra tensed, ready to spring into action, but Sebastian's hand on her arm held her back. The new figure was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding. He was a lycanthrope, one of their leaders. The traitor stood up, meeting the lycanthrope with a nervous nod. They exchanged words in low tones, too quiet for Lyra to hear from her position, but the tension was palpable. The lycanthrope's eyes never left the man as they spoke, their conversation swift and urgent. The traitor's hands trembled as he handed over the map. He was giving something away, something important. Lyra's heart sank as she realized the full extent of the betrayal. The man wasn't just passing information. He was providing the lycanthropes with a blueprint, a guide to the kingdom's weaknesses. He had been a part of the court for years, and now he was feeding them everything they needed to strike at the heart of their defenses. "We need to stop him," Lyra muttered, her voice a low hiss of fury. "Before it's too late." Sebastian didn't argue. He simply nodded, his eyes locked on the scene in front of them. But as the two figures turned to leave, something unexpected happened. The lycanthrope leader stopped, looking back toward the ruins. His gaze swept the area as if sensing something. Lyra froze, holding her breath. But the lycanthrope didn't move toward them. Instead, he nodded to the traitor, as if giving him permission to go. "Now," Lyra whispered, grabbing Sebastian's arm and pulling him into motion. They moved quickly, silently, their vampire speed and agility allowing them to close the distance without making a sound. But just as they were about to reach the edge of the ruins, the lycanthrope turned again, his eyes narrowing. His sharp senses had detected something, perhaps the faintest whisper of their presence. Before Lyra could react, he was already in motion, moving toward them with the speed and grace that only a lycanthrope could possess. His eyes burned with a predatory gleam as he closed the gap between them. Lyra pushed Sebastian to the side, stepping forward to face the approaching danger. She could feel the adrenaline surge through her veins, her instincts kicking in. She didn't want to fight, not now, not like this, but she had no choice. The lycanthrope had already seen them, and it was clear he wasn't going to let them escape. The lycanthrope lunged at her with incredible speed, his claws slashing through the air. Lyra barely managed to dodge, her body moving with the fluid grace of a predator. She countered quickly, her own fangs bared as she struck, aiming for his throat. The lycanthrope recoiled, but he wasn't unarmed. He grabbed her arm, twisting it with a strength that nearly sent her crashing to the ground. She gritted her teeth against the pain, using her enhanced vampire strength to break free. With a swift kick, she sent him stumbling back, giving her just enough time to regain her footing. Sebastian was at her side now, his face a mask of concentration as he assessed the situation. "We need to finish this quickly," he said, his voice tight with urgency. Lyra nodded, her eyes never leaving the lycanthrope. The fight wasn't over yet. They needed to act fast before the lycanthropes realized that they were onto their plan. With one final burst of speed, Lyra charged at the lycanthrope, aiming for his chest. He tried to dodge, but she was faster. Her claws sank into his flesh, and with a sharp twist, she brought him to the ground. He let out a strangled cry before falling silent. Panting, Lyra stood over him, her eyes cold as she looked down at the defeated lycanthrope. "This ends now," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Sebastian moved beside her, his hand on her shoulder as he nodded. "We've got to stop the traitor. He can't be allowed to leave here alive." Lyra nodded in agreement. No one betrays the kingdom and gets away with it. Together, they moved toward the man who had caused so much destruction. The traitor's days were numbered, and they weren't going to let him destroy everything they had worked so hard to protect. The journey toward the traitor had taken everything Lyra had. She was tired physically, mentally, emotionally, but there was no time to stop. The war was far from over, and the lycanthropes were closing in. The traitor had to be dealt with, and then they had to focus on the battle that loomed ahead. If they didn't stop the lycanthrope forces soon, the entire kingdom would fall. The traitor had led them deep into the heart of the enemy's territory. He had been carefully orchestrating their defeat for months, feeding information to the lycanthropes, guiding them to the kingdom's weaknesses. He had been a shadow, hidden in plain sight, and now, finally, Lyra and Sebastian had caught up with him. The air was thick with tension as they stood at the edge of the hidden base. The traitor had been waiting for them, no doubt, and they could feel his presence, dark and cold, like a shadow creeping over their every move. Sebastian stood beside Lyra, his eyes scanning the area. He was always calm, always thinking ahead, but Lyra could see the tension in his jaw, the tightness in his shoulders. He had never fully trusted the traitor, and now his instincts had been proven right. There was no more room for doubt. "We need to go in quietly," Lyra whispered, her voice low and steady. "We can't afford to let them know we're here." Sebastian nodded. "I'll take the left flank, you take the right. We'll close in on him from both sides." Without another word, they split up, moving through the dense trees and underbrush. Lyra's vampire senses were on high alert. She could hear every rustle of the leaves, every bird call in the distance. The air was thick with the scent of blood, of death, and it made her feel alive in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. The traitor had made the mistake of underestimating her. He thought he could manipulate the court, deceive everyone around him, but he had failed to see one thing, the strength of her will. Lyra was no ordinary princess. She was a warrior, and nothing would stand in her way. She moved swiftly, her feet barely making a sound as she approached the base. The stone walls loomed ahead, and she could sense the traitor's presence just beyond them. Her fangs flashed as her anger boiled over. He had betrayed her, her family, her kingdom. There was no forgiveness for that. Sebastian's voice came through her earpiece, steady and calm as always. "I've reached the left side, no sign of movement yet. Are you in position?" "Almost there," Lyra replied, her eyes narrowing as she crept closer to the entrance. "I'll take the lead, stay close." She reached the corner of the stone structure and peered around it. Through the cracks, she could see the traitor standing with a group of lycanthropes, speaking in low tones. He was gesturing with his hands, probably explaining the next phase of their plan. He had no idea that his time was up. Lyra drew in a breath, her hand gripping the hilt of the sword at her side. She was ready. She would not let him escape. She would not let him bring ruin to everything she had fought for. With a silent command, she signaled to Sebastian. It was time. They struck simultaneously. Lyra moved like a shadow, her speed unmatched. She dashed forward, slamming into one of the lycanthropes, knocking him to the ground before he had a chance to react. Her claws extended, sharp as knives, and she went straight for the traitor. He turned just in time to see her coming, his face a mask of shock and fear. "You," he hissed, his voice full of disbelief. "How did you find me?" Lyra's eyes were cold, unyielding. "You underestimated me," she said, her voice like ice. "And now you will pay the price." The traitor stumbled backward, his hand reaching for a weapon at his side. But he was too slow. Lyra's claws were faster. She reached out, grabbing his wrist and twisting it until he dropped the weapon. He fell to the ground, gasping in pain. "You were always weak," Lyra continued, her voice laced with fury. "You thought you could betray me, the kingdom, the people we swore to protect. But you were wrong." Sebastian was at her side now, his eyes scanning the other lycanthropes who were regrouping and preparing to fight. "We need to end this quickly," he said, his voice low but determined. "We can't let them warn the others." Lyra nodded, her gaze never leaving the traitor. "This ends now." In a blur of motion, she moved. The traitor tried to scramble to his feet, but she was on him before he could even blink. With one swift movement, she slammed him to the ground, her fangs bared in a snarl. She could feel the warmth of his blood beneath her, and for a moment she considered ending it right then and there. But she didn't. There was something more important than that. The traitor's eyes widened in fear as Lyra held him down. "You will never win," he spat, his voice hoarse. "The war is already lost. The lycanthropes will take everything from you. They will burn this kingdom to the ground." Lyra's grip tightened on his throat. "Not if I stop them first." With a single, powerful strike, she ended it. The traitor was dead before he could say another word. His betrayal, his lies had all come to an end. Sebastian stepped forward, his eyes dark with the weight of their actions. "It's done." Lyra didn't respond at first. She stood over the traitor's lifeless body, her chest heaving with the exertion of the fight. The anger was still there, bubbling beneath the surface, but she knew this wasn't the end. It was just one battle in a much larger war. The lycanthropes would not stop. They would come for them again. "We have to move quickly," she said, her voice steadying as she turned to face the rest of the lycanthrope forces. "The war is far from over," Sebastian nodded. "We've taken out the traitor, but the war will continue. We'll need all our strength to defeat them." With a final glance at the traitor's body, Lyra turned and moved toward the heart of the battle. The lycanthropes were already regrouping, but this time they would not have the element of surprise. This time they would fight together, human and vampire, side by side. The battle that awaited them would be the greatest test of their strength and unity. But Lyra knew one thing for certain: she would not back down. She would fight for her kingdom, for her people, and for the future they all shared. As they charged into the fray, Lyra's heart beat with the rhythm of war. It was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. The fate of the kingdom, the fate of everything she had worked for, rested on the outcome of this final battle, and she would not let it fall.